Okay, I can see the attendees coming.
They're coming in, huh? Yeah. They're Malaysian, mainly Malaysian, Emelia, no?
I
From
think
Malaysia.
so, from what I'm seeing, seem to be Malaysian names here. So I'm just gonna wait for a couple of minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Will you get a cue from Stephanie?
Stephanie has disappeared.
You're on your own. Okay. I think you can decide.
Right. Okay. 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 It's 5. I suppose we could. Hey, good evening to everyone. Yeah. Hi, Muhammad Sharman. So to all the attendees, we won't be having any breaks in between, so you can grab your water or whatever it is you need beside you or your notebooks. And we'll start soon. Okay, so since it's 5:01, I think we'll start, yeah? Or do you want to wait for a minute or so for more of them to come in?
Could I suggest 5 minutes? Would you mind waiting 5 minutes?
Yeah, sure, sure. Okay, I think we can start. Okay. All right. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first session of Gallery Weekend Kuala Lumpur 2020. My name is Emelia, and I will be moderating today's session with Patrick Flores. And I'm really so grateful that we can still continue to do this gallery weekend virtually in the midst of this partial lockdown. And I know some of you are also tuning in from overseas. It's great that the art community can still continue to come together like this and keep connected and keep the conversations moving during this pandemic. So without further ado, I'm going to explain quickly how this session will run. I'm going to introduce Patrick in a moment, and he will be speaking for about 40 to 45 minutes. And then after that, we will have a time of discussion for about 20 minutes, maybe. And after that, it will be open for Q&A session with Patrick. So if you notice, there is a chat button for you to enter any comments you may have while the session is going on. And then there is also a Q&A button. And this is where you would enter your specific questions for Patrick for the Q&A session. So please keep your questions in the Q&A section so that I won't miss any of your questions. And do keep it as concise as you can, all right? So any other comments can go in the chat, all right? So let's start with the program, and let me introduce our guest speaker for today. Patrick Flores is currently the Professor of Art Studies at the University of the Philippines. He is the Curator of the Vargas Museum in Manila, Curator of the Arts Division of the Philippine National Museum, and Adjunct Curator at the National Art Gallery of Singapore. Patrick was a visiting fellow at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, 1999, and an Asian Public Intellectuals Fellow in 2004. He was a grantee of the Asian Cultural Council 2010, and in 2011, a member of the advisory board of the exhibition, The Global Contemporary Art Worlds After 1989 in Karlsruhe, Germany. He was also a member of the Guggenheim Museum's Asian Art Council 2011 and a co-editor of the Southeast Asian issue of Third Text in 2011. He is the author of Painting History, Revisions in Philippine Colonial Art in 1999, and Past Peripheral Curation in Southeast Asia, published in 2008. He was one of the curators of Under Construction, New Dimensions in Asian Art in Japan, and Gwangju Biennale in 2008 in Korea. So today, he will speak to us about his experience as the Artistic Director of the Singapore Biennale 2019, the Curator for Viva XCon 2020 in the Philippines, and the Curator of the Philippines Pavilion of the Venice Biennale in 2021. So right now, let me pass the time to Patrick. Patrick, thanks very much for being here today. And we're really happy that you can join us all the way from the Philippines.
Thank you, Emelia, for the wonderful introduction. And also thank you to Shalini for this invitation, and huge congratulations for this important initiative. I would like to share my slides now. Okay. So I titled this talk, True to Scale, Curating in Cycles. And I prepared something for this afternoon. I start now. Reading the brief of this event, I was drawn to the phrases pioneering the creative and more value. These formulations signify aspirations arising from the appreciation of risk as a necessity of originating something and the desire to further the achievement. I see these words forming the basis of origins and extensions, impulses to which biennales as platforms of deliberate selection and decisive inclusion speak. To take risks and to pioneer is to fulfill the potential of this platform and also to mark its limits. to be original or be a point of origin, and to realize that it is not enough. This is the condition of the Biennale, the source of its anxiety and the thrill of insisting on it time and again. This anxiety ultimately feeds into the curatorial intelligence. Biennales are shaped by curatorial discourse, and curators do not just exemplify this discourse, they perform it as they curate the Biennale through gestures that translate to the circulation of materials, the creation of situations, and the production of hopefully reciprocal discourse. The Biennale iteration, therefore, is not empty. It is charged, and one must closely read the signs and not just easily recognize certain iconographies and signatures and pass them off as the basis of an assessment or a critique. A Biennale speaks to this desire to be true to the condition of the current world. That truthfulness should surmount the literal geography or the restrictive geopolitics in which the Biennale is located. Since a Biennale is worldly, it should work with art that is equivalently so in terms of its materiality and the broad sympathies of its makers. Also, because the Biennale is expected to be exciting and different, it gains a latitude to experiment, to experiment with modalities that surface this robust materiality and sympathy beyond the exhibition, which on its own has a very dynamic potential. With these thoughts in mind, I am reminded of Gayatri Spivak's provocative remarks in Dhaka in 2018 for the Dhaka Art Summit, where she said that an art event like the Summit, which is a broad exhibition of contemporary art taking place in Bangladesh, needs a supplement. And this supplement is to question the totality to which the event aspires. This notion of totality must be nuanced. Its appeal to the total has something to do with its ability and its power to gather art from different geographies, crossing national borders, assembling diverse aesthetic forms and technologies, and facilitating exchange between discourses of various registers. All this flows into a totality, although not seamlessly and not without strain. But with this semblance of totality is also the mechanism of limits. For the curation of a biennale requires control and deliberate selection that while provisionally enforced is not terminal because the biennale iterates, it repeats. And every time it turns, it gathers other species and intelligences in the creative world. This contentious concern of Spivak cannot be resolved easily. The more reason its trouble must be kept, though not indulged or belabored. It is a question that speaks to a lack, according to her, and to exceed the aspiration. For Spivak, the need for a supplement pressures the event to encompass what she calls the incalculable dangerousness of the broadest base of human reality and to look towards a socially just world. In this regard, in the context of this gallery weekend in Kuala Lumpur and my work as a curator of the Biennale platform, let us revisit the persistent potential of the exhibition as a language and a vehicle to convey the sensible materials of the contemporary world. If contemporary art is more than just objects and engagement is more than just spectatorship, what do we make of the exhibition? The next director of the Sydney Biennale, the Colombian Jose Roca, continues to express faith in the exhibition. And his words are instructive, and I quote him, "I am above all an exhibition maker. I believe in the exhibition as a device. I believe in the experience, not only visual or intellectual, but bodily experience of the viewer." This being said, Roca would also look beyond contemporary art to include design, furniture, material culture, and local voices, according to him, that lie outside the realm of art. So again, here in this quote from Roca, we take note of the effort to exceed not only the exhibition, but contemporary art altogether. These sentiments, these sentiments were also at play when I directed the Singapore Biennale in 2019. Let me begin with a tableau that may be expressed in the well-known phrase in Singapore, from a fishing village to a modern nation state. This was the trope which clarified the arc of time that governed the dioramas of Singapore history, commissioned by the National Museum of Singapore in the 1980s. Such a colonial imaginary would persist neoliberally in 2019 with the commemoration of the bicentenary of the arrival of the British in Singapore, that is now the Potemkin city of late capital in the counter-polemic of the architect Rem Koolhaas. In the same year, I directed the sixth iteration of the Singapore Biennale, heir to the 19th century exposition and exemplary of the global contemporary. The coincidences of the iterative biennale and colonial time condensing in the spectral diorama, a veritable world picture, gave me pause to think about how the interface between globalization and miniaturization could propose a different trajectory of worldliness via history and the contemporary within the exhibition. The dioramas, these maquettes which limn decisive events as picturesque, were hewn painstakingly and delicately by craft persons from Paete in Laguna, south of the capital of Manila in the Philippines. With this subcontract of exceptional local labor, the Filipino artisans would thus carve out a space for the Philippine moment in signifying colonial history in a museum in Singapore. It is surely a history as well of craft, of image, and of art that migrates and circulates translocally. But inflecting this diffusion is a colonial tension that disturbs the passage of the contemporary through its modernity. The title of the Biennale addresses this frisson of restiveness through the words of Salud Algabre, a woman revolutionary who took part in a rebellion against the Americans in the 30s in the same province of the Carvers. The insurrection fell apart quite quickly, though Algabre remained undiminished. Years later, when a historian queried her where she had gone after the attack against the imperialist apparatus failed, she rectified him by saying, "No uprising fails. Each one is a step in the right direction." The intersection between the carvers and the insurgent opens up a latitude for more articulations of Philippine agency honed in the crucible of three successive colonialisms from the 16th century to the middle of the 20th to dwell in and permeate the Biennale of the present. Directing a Biennale like Singapore Biennale 2019 titled Every Step in the Right Direction, I would let this anxiety generate a repertoire of options in Biennale making. I did not want at the outset to merely contain the milieu and convey it into the folds of the Biennale, so to speak. Instead, I thought of ways to expand the field of the Biennale's milieu so that initiations that have staked out the ground over time would broaden the Biennale without reducing the latter to an instrument or a reflection. I was interested in practices that ethically and geopoetically created cooperative social form. This was why I turned to Carlos Villa, a Filipino-American artist who critically engaged with abstract expressionism by inflecting it with the life world of the Pacific, the Philippines, migrancy, pedagogy, and activism, and assembling materials like feather, blood, semen, and so on in the context of customary ritual, as well as multiculturalism and systemic racism in the United States. In 1976, for instance, he curated Other Sources, an American essay, in the year that the United States of America was commemorating its bicentenary as a nation, gathering women, erotic and political dissidents, and people of color in situations of feasting, singing, and conversing. Villa conjured another world or constellation of tides. In the other seminal year, 1989, thought to be by certain art historians and curators as the ground zero of the contemporary, he began to cobble together Worlds in Collision, a series of symposia on the practices and discourses of an increasingly mixed and asymmetrical art world in the United States. For Villa, this was a form of action, at the same time that it was the name given to a multicultural art history course he had earlier designed. This syllabus seminar was an inquiry, according to Villa, about what happened to civil rights and in particular, what happened to civil rights for artists. This agenda found a medium in a participatory forum in which presentations in the lecture hall were interspersed not only with poetry, music, and meals, but also a successful spatial fluidity was established between formal and informal gatherings. Again, the festival modality surfaces, linking up with what Joseph Beuys would consider a permanent seminar of intense intellection. Speaking to this spirit, I invited to the Singapore Biennale a grassroots post-genocide circus based in Battambang in Cambodia. FAR, the Battambang Circus, fosters the social welfare of young adults and their families through art schools, education programs, and social support. The collective was formed by 9 Cambodian men with their French teacher after returning from a refugee camp in 1994. I am taken by the liveliness and vitality that inhere in the circus act, its joyful sociality and the energy and discipline with which performative bodies are formed. Their nature at once liberated and rigorously regimented, open to defiant and precarious routines. I am also struck by how teaching and action are intertwined, in which the circus is simultaneously a school, a theater, an exhibition area, a common space in the town. For me, the circus transcends the festival spectacle binary and inaugurates a new locus of survival and pleasure, of excitedness. Finally, to further pursue the program of a broad matrix for Singapore Biennale, I collaborated with local initiatives that in the course of the years have cultivated publics, communities, audiences, or other formations and congregations. I regarded this aspect as equivalent to the exhibitionary platform of the Biennale. The Biennale tapped the vein of their long-standing, thoroughgoing toil to widen its own sphere of encounters and enhance more chances of meetings with people beyond the art world. The engagement with these spaces sought to access their energy, and in a reciprocal spirit, these spaces could very similarly amplify their scope to be part of a hopefully interdisciplinary art world and a contemporary art that is grounded in ecologies. I called this the coordinates, which touched on 3 phases of creative form in Singapore and elsewhere. And these are heritage, moving image, and performance. So I worked with a tour group, which you saw earlier, 2 museums, 2 theater organizations. So this is one from the National University of Singapore Museum, a cinematheque, and a Eurasian library. The 4-month Biennale opened in November 2019 and closed March this year. It was during the month of February that precautions were put in place in Singapore in light of a significant number of infections. After controlling the rate of infection and transmission for a period of time, there came a spike towards the end of the Biennale. We therefore had to amend some programs. For instance, the conference that was supposed to happen on the first week of March migrated to an online platform, and the closing events were live streamed instead. They proved to be successful in terms of generating public support. I was happy to know that in spite of the public health crisis, the Biennale remained open all throughout, although foot traffic decreased, foreign visitors diminished, and viewers became fretful about interacting with works that invited their participation. Interestingly, the viral atmosphere that caught up with the Biennale in the middle of its run was sort of foreshadowed by the problems I encountered with the loans of the works of Alfonso Osorio from New York. The congregation series of Osorio was key in my curatorial thinking about the Biennale. These assemblages done in the 50s and 60s consisted of a swarm of species and substances from skulls to carapaces to antlers to teeth and eyeballs, shells and mirrors, and so on. For these works to travel, they must comply with the requirements of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES, put into force in 1975. It is an international agreement between governments. Its aim is to ensure that international trade in specimens of wild animals and plants does not threaten their survival. A government agency of the signatory nation state has to implement the convention. And since I was borrowing works from New York, the US Fish and Wildlife Service had to look at the works, and the lender had to engage a genomics expert who would properly identify the species found in the works and confidently conclude that they are not endangered. If one were to look at the works of Osorio, who was born in the Philippines, it is quite hard to disaggregate the materials. He creatively integrated within his pieces with such fascinating intricacy and density, so that the constellation of things became like mangroves or a microcosmos. And he himself thought of this idiosyncratic form not so much as an accumulation, as of a continuity. According to Osorio, they all work together. Either the bone disintegrates or it is fused into the picture. It is a step in the continuity. It's not dead, it's continuing. End of quote. I thought that the idea of a congregation demonstrated the work of the Biennale to gather the familiar and the eccentric in a shared space, and in this common ground, the public may deliberate upon the difficulties of difference and also of coming together. I started to get worried when the lender in New York would not clear the work because the US Fish and Wildlife Service suspected that there were more species than those accounted for by a scientist from the Smithsonian commissioned by the lender. That loan had to be canceled, and I had to turn to collectors in the Philippines who had Osorios. I found two lenders who were willing to lend, only that we had to go through the CITES process again, this time with the National Museum in the Philippines and the Biodiversity Management Bureau of the Department of Environment and Natural Resources. To cut a long story short, we managed to send over to Singapore only 3 Osorios for a space that was supposed to contain 8. That's why you see a bit of the discrepancy in terms of space management. This posed a curatorial problem for me, which made me realize that because the concern was CITES, the solution should also be CITES, the declaration of which I printed and displayed in the museum, which you see on the left side. It was an instructive moment for me and a self-reflexive gesture on the part of the Biennale to lay bare the predicaments of its own production. For me, the Osorium episode spoke to the curatorial vision of the Biennale, that the material of Osorio's art is possibly the entire world itself, and that the migrations within this world are restricted because the planet and its peoples are themselves imperiled, if not desiccated and exhausted. The situation therefore demystified the idea of a borderless world and reminded us of how the traffic of species and elements such as viruses or endangered flora and fauna may end up compromising the world that art should supposedly represent. As the Singapore Biennale 2019 was about to close in March 2020, there was a spike in the transmission of the virus in Singapore, throwing a sharp uh, there was a spike in the transmission of the virus in Singapore, which somehow complicated the narrative of the achievement of the government of the only first world country in Southeast Asia in suppressing the outbreak. Central in the spread were the overcrowded dormitories of foreign workers in Singapore, throwing a sharp light on the plight of migrant work and its relationship with the economy of the country. According to the journalist Kirsten Hahn, most male migrant workers brought into work in the construction, shipyard, and petrochemical industries are housed in dormitories, many in industrial parts of the island, away from the rest of the population. Even before the pandemic, these crowded, stuffy lodgings were a recipe for disaster, according to the journalist. The disaster is disease, from Zika to dengue. It is telling that in delineating the migrant problematic in the pandemic, the locus of the diagnosis is the living conditions of the workers. Han continues that the COVID-19 pandemic has drawn attention to living conditions in these dormitories of workers paid so poorly and prone to repatriation. They are also seen as threats to public order and therefore subject to surveillance even on their days off. So I thought that this moment in the life of the Biennale of Singapore um, complicated the aspiration of a Biennale uh, to a totality that was mentioned earlier by Spiva, and also prompts or pressures the curator to offer a supplement, how to supplement this aspiration to totality through other means of engaging with the material of the Biennale. So that is, I think, an important thing to consider in this issue of the politics of curating a Biennale. The second exhibition is Viva. As one of the most sustained artist-initiated biennales in Southeast Asia, the Viva XCon or Visayan Artists Exhibit and Conference, Visayan Artists Exhibit and Conference, organizes its 16th iteration in Bacolod City in Negros Occidental, one of the islands in the Philippines, has organized, opened, it already opened. It opened on last November 8, 2020, and is envisioned to evolve patiently in phases until July 2021 for an exhibition program, because this was the pressure of the pandemic. So formed in 1990 by the collective Black artists in Asia, the itinerant Viva XCon, because it moves around the islands every 2 years. The itinerant the itinerant Viva XCon has striven to carve out a space and perspective for artists in the central islands of the Philippines called the Visayas. Through its efforts to foster an inter-island ecology distinct from, albeit not isolated from, the art world in the capital of Manila, Viva XCon has achieved over the years a collaborative and participatory ethos of art making, mutual support, and solidarity unique in the Philippine archipelago. Viva XCon 2020 promises to be responsive to the conditions shaped by the pandemic and offers an agenda that rethinks notions of the festival and the exhibition. Facing the prospects of the future, it holds up the name the soon, a word, a vernacular that means next, and an idiosyncratic connective in everyday language to signify and then. It thus speculates on the things to come as it narrates stories of an ever-turning present. The main exhibition of Viva Excon is Kalibutan, The World in Mind. I am the head curator and I will be collaborating with 6 curators from the Visayas. And the project will unfold incrementally in modular form from November 2020 to July 2021. So I envision this as some kind of a slow curation that will crawl from November 20 from November 2020 to July 2021. And so my concept of Kalibutan, the world in mind, is incremental, protracted, and flexible. So this is one way to respond to the pandemic, to the time of the pandemic. It's also diverse and dynamic, meaning it works with artists in the art world, but also with cultural workers beyond the art world. And it is collaborative. I'm working with 6 curators from the region. So this is also a an effort to develop curatorial resources in the region. So the exhibition takes inspiration from the Visayan word, kalibutan, which refers to both the world and consciousness. So it is quite a unique word that combines both the world itself and the consciousness about the world. It doesn't exist in Tagalog, which is or Filipino, which is the national language. It's quite unique to the Visayan lexicon. So it is a dense and intricate term because it brings together world making and world view. The world is embodied on the one hand and the body is inworlded on the other. It is rare for a word to register simultaneously cosmos and cognition. This is the prompt for the curatorial work on the Visayas, to create conditions for expressive material that responds to the range of stimuli of an active ecology. Mindfulness of the world acknowledges complicity in its production, as well as the indeterminacy of its vastness. From November 2020 to July 2021, the scheme of a seminar on a possible exhibition, a supplement to Kalibutan, will play out virtually around the following nodes: curators converse, artists explore, works disclose, and exhibitions not exhibitions. So these nodes will play out incrementally beginning next month, no? Involving or focusing on curators, on artists, on works themselves, and also on the prospects of curating in the time of pandemic. This seminar sensitively attends to the reconstitutions of the chastened world in pandemic time in the context of the viral and also the vernacular. I propose the modalities above as a way to deepen discussion on the current atmosphere shaped by the everyday and the emergency. The theorist Ben Anderson, in a chapter for the book Time, A Vocabulary of the Present, has written in an instructive essay on the relationship between the temporalities of the everyday and of the emergency, which are thought to be of opposite tendencies. We realize, however, that increasingly the two inform each other more intricately. The pandemic makes this realization starker. The structures and agencies embedded in everyday life have laid bare the current life world as precarious and therefore deserving of the term emergency. The lines between the everyday and the emergency may have been more osmotic or have broken down, according to Anderson. According to him, and I quote him, the contemporary condition of human life is life lived in uncertainty, recalling the roots of the term emergency in emergere, arising or bring to light. The lines that surround and demarcate emergencies become blurred. A key concept here entwined with emergency is exception. And Anderson continues, the category of emergency does not, however, name only an exception that interrupts normal life and issues in a time out of time. Emergency is a term that is inseparable from a series of temporalities. The claim is that action is necessary immediately in order to meet the exception. The other impulse of the proposition of Kalibutan is from the field of anthropology by way of Jean-Paul Dumont's Visayan vignettes, ethnographic traces of an island. Dumont explicates the nuances of life in Siquijor, which is the island being studied, and in doing so probes the very language of description. According to Dumont, I propose a plurality of images, vignettes that superimpose themselves upon each other to create an out-of-focus ensemble, since cultural contours are never sharp and stories never straight, according to Dumont. The use of vignettes is interesting because the word is simultaneously about architecture and image, an ornament of leaves and tendrils in buildings, and a portrait showing only head and shoulders with background gradually shaded off. It's a character sketch. I am drawn to this elaboration of form as well as its sheerness or mereness. To this rumination, he tosses over the Visayan word hulagway, which is generally a picture, a delineation, an imagination. It is composed from hulad, which means to depict and to translate, and dagway, which pertains to face and appearance, as well as to subjunctive moments as signaled by the adverbs perhaps or probably. So all these terms cluster around hulagway, which is thought to be only a noun, but actually is also an adverb. Our contribution to this discussion, of course, is the philosophy of kalibutan, a conceptualization of the world and of consciousness, of ecology and speculation. It is simultaneously time and place, as well as the mediation of them by the senses and the ethos. Without doubt, our kalibutan can only touch on the everyday and emergency delicately and urgently. So just some of the works that we are thinking of for Kalibutan uh, from artists who are from the Visayas or of the Visayas or have roots in the Visayas or have spent considerable time in the Visayas. So we have someone like Lani Maestro who will present this neon work also over time in the exhibition, not exhibition. Leo Abaya, who will have this unfolding diorama that will be present virtually from December or maybe January to July next year. And I'm also working with Joar Songkuya, who is a sailor, uh, a seaman, who is also an artist. So I'd like to play out his archives across time from maybe January to July. He has been to a lot of places as a seaman. So where he goes, he writes some diary entries on these places like the ones you see on the screen from Indian Ocean and from Amsterdam. So these are diaries, and there are also photographs of his time in the ship and also early works. So the archival could be a supplement to the exhibitionary. So this is a curatorial experiment that I think is responsive also to pandemic time and also to the virtual platform, because these things can incrementally or protractedly surface and alight, emerge, no? In a time of emergency. And at the same time, they are also everyday life of the seaman who is also an artist. So this is quite interesting proposition. And then finally, and takes us to the end of the talk this afternoon, I will curate the Taiwan Pavilion in the Venice Biennale, although I'm sure mainland China will not call it a pavilion because it's not a nation state. No? But that also makes it interesting. The work of Sakulio Pavalijung comes from a distinct place in the vast creative world of Taiwan, as it is rooted and reared in the indigenous life world of the Taiwan people. So is it in the same breath in dynamic interaction with the quickly changing social context around it. Sakulio stands in this intersection and endeavors to transform spaces across and within it. Shaping his practice is the impulse of a knowledge generator who pursues visual research of persistent mythology, collective strategy, and an encompassing cosmology through drawing, photography, and also animation. On the other hand, he reveals a lively intelligence for artistic intervention through sculpted form, built environment, installation, and the cultural labor of revitalizing heritage. He is a person of broad sympathies, and I was so happy to have visited him before the pandemic happened. That was my last trip out of Manila. I returned in Manila in March. No? So I'm honored, of course, to be curating Sakulio for Venice Biennale now in 2022 because it has been moved. I am interested in this complex artistic language and his deep engagement with his community in Sandimen in Pingtung County, which is in the south of Taiwan. Coming from the Philippines and Southeast Asia, I am keen to plot out coordinates between these 2 points of the South in the larger context of Austronesian culture and to reflect on the current discussion on what it means to be either contemporary or local. So this is the first time that the Taiwan Pavilion is presenting a so-called indigenous artist. Sakulio seems to say that this is a false binary, this contemporary or local, as he animates an ecology inspired by the spirit of ancestors and reinvented by the vision of the citizen artists, a term coined by Gita Kapoor. Citizen artists we meet every day. Curating the Taiwan Pavilion in Venice, and this is the wonderful site of the Taiwan Pavilion, which is very central near the Duomo, near the Church of St. Mark, and also near the famous tourist trap, the Bridge of Sighs. I think on the left side is the Bridge of Sighs. So this is really central, as central as it can get. No? And it's not in the Arsenale or the Giardini where most of the pavilions are. Curating the Taiwan Pavilion in Venice is very much of interest as it complicates the idea of a nation state in a biennale, which is supposed to be between nations, international context. Taiwan is within Chinese discourse, of course, we know that, but it is not China. In fact, it contradicts the hegemony of China. The artist Sakulio, for his part, is not of Chinese lineage, but Austronesian and may well be proximate to Southeast Asia. Reflecting on the 3 projects I briefly discussed, I think there should be greater dissipation of the artistic and curatorial material into multiple and equivalent, though uneven scales. And every curatorial initiation should be true to the scale within which it finds its measure, as well as its experiments or extensions, its risks or its efforts to pioneer the creative, to speak to this event. Curatorial efforts come in a series, and so there is no need to consolidate so much in a singular venture. I am not a fan of spectacles and blockbusters. In the examples I presented, I cite a biennale in Singapore, a biennale in an island, in a group of islands in the Philippines, and a pavilion in Venice. I see them as relays in my practice, attempts to navigate the ecology of contemporary art that is marked not by continents, but by archipelagos and mangroves, with all the tides and the thickets. I am wary of efforts that rely on the signature of artists or art forms that can easily be captured, simplified for convenience and possible commodification, and drained of their complexity or difficulty. For me, they tend to become franchises of the global inventory. I am more interested in dispersed, even tricky materialities that propose plural trajectories instead of a monolithic image or a fully formed accomplishment. I think what the pandemic has made us realize is a need for the Biennale modality to signify precarity and vulnerability in the context of a persistent resistance and patience. That's what the line every step in the right direction had sought to evoke. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Patrick. Okay, I hope everybody can hear me clearly. I think just now somebody mentioned my audio was not very clear. I hope it's clear right now. Okay, thanks very much, Patrick, for your very interesting talk. And really, there are so many considerations that goes into the planning of the Biennale. And it does sound very challenging to sort of keep everything in balance and at the same time do something original or pioneering, as you mentioned, you know. And I also really love the point you made that the Biennale is worldly, and it has to work with works of art that are, you know, equally worldly in its sympathies. And, and thus, a lot of the works include voices that are outside the realm of art, as you pointed out. Yeah. And finally, you know, I like the idea of curating in cycles, as you've put it, you know, that we don't put all our expectations on a singular biennale and expect it to do everything, but to look at it as a step in the right direction and to look at the continuity of biennales. I'm going to start off with the question with the very last point that you made in the conclusion, that these biennales are attempts to navigate the ecology of contemporary art that is marked not by continents, and I would include by nations, not by nations as well, but by archipelagos and mangroves. And would you say that more and more curators are emphasizing the fluidity and the interconnectedness of the art ecology across continents, you know, by moving away from restrictive geopolitics? And if this is so, you know, can you comment on the fact that the national or the nation still features very strongly. Artists are still being represented according to, you know, where they come from. And do you see this as a sort of conflict to what you're trying to achieve, or does this help us to see how borders are being crossed?
Yeah, interesting question, Emelia, and it will take a semester to to parse everything. But let me take the last part first, no? About this the specter of the national as possibly over determining identity, for instance, or the meaning of a particular artwork. No? So this particular Biennale, this particular edition of the Singapore Biennale, I was quite free to explore the world, no? Without being confined to the region. For several iterations before this, the Biennale was quite focused on Southeast Asia. Although I have to say that the first two were actually not. No, so there was this movements within the Biennale framework, no, in Singapore. No? So from international biennale of more or less, you know, the typical kind, to a regional biennale, and then finally something that maybe is in between. But I thought also that it was important to invest in the critical density of Southeast Asia as an important geography of art, an art world in this constellation of the contemporary. So I retained that focus maybe 40% as an anchor for the Biennale. So I'm raising this to speak to your question of how do we respond to the question of nation? Do we dismiss it as no longer salient or relevant, or do we work ourselves through it and at some point propose a larger context for this constituency that is encompassed by the nation. So that's what I did, Emelia, in the Biennale to look at how the nation still informs
Right.
the work of art, but also how other trajectories or how other entry points shape the subjectivity of these forms. No? So one way to do this is to propose a different map, a different cartography or different ways to situate Southeast Asia in relation, for instance, to Australasia, to the Pacific. I showed a slide of Carlos Villa. So he is Filipino, a diasporic artist working in San Francisco, but he was looking towards the Pacific and the Philippines, of course, and in the context of multiculturalism in America in 1976. So practices themselves propose the cartography. It's not as if I'm just slotting people in existing cartographies. I give the practices of artists a chance to propose uh, their own worlding, so that we don't rely on normative mappings of the world. So this is why the idea of the archipelago and the mangrove offer not only ecological materialities, because they are, no? But also tropes, no? Curatorial tropes, or also procedures, methods in curating. So they are both. They partake of the ecological, but they can also be seen as modes of making biennales. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to switch gears here a little bit, Patrick, if you don't mind, and
Sure.
ask you something a little bit more personal.
Okay.
As a curator, yeah, how and why did you come to do what you're doing today? Your work as a curator. Can you tell us a little bit about your work as a curator, how you developed that, and how your work has changed from your very first project to what it is today?
Yeah, it's looking back now. I was trained in art history, so it was a time when curatorial programs were not yet existing. So I learned how to curate through my training in art history. But it was a different kind of art history. It's not the very specialized art history we know in the West. It was an art history that was in the context of the humanities. So it was broader in its conception of what constitutes the study of art. So it was largely also a study of culture and society. And my mentors, my teachers were not trained art historians. Some of them were artists, activists, some worked on anthropology, and so on and so forth. So it was a different kind of art history informed by the humanities. So that was my training in that was how I was introduced to the world of art. I was also my MA was also in art history, and I worked on colonial art. So this fixation on the colonial allowed me to navigate the movement of the notion of art from the colonial moment to the modern moment and also to the contemporary moment. So that's why I was happy to note that when I curated the Singapore Biennale, it was this commemoration, it was the time of a commemoration of a colonial moment in Singapore, the arrival of Raffles. And that the title of the Biennale also was also a response to the colonial moment. Salud Al-Gabre was an insurgent, a revolutionary who was against the practices of American imperialism and advocated total freedom, total and immediate freedom. So I think that was one way to, that's one way to answer your question, that it was through art history and then art history that tried to broaden itself, and an art history that was also aware of the post-colonial questions of what constitutes art, and an art history that was conscious of how things are represented, how things are put in place, and how things circulate in a public sphere. So I think those were the entry points into curating. Yeah.
Right. That's great. And I wonder what is your view on, many artists look at this Biennale as a sort of turning point in their artistic career, and being selected for a Biennale is still considered very prestigious. And the selection process is assumed to be very competitive, So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about this selection process, or can you comment on it as a curator?
Yeah, of course, it is cultural capital to be part of the of a biennale, and also it offers you visibility and platform to be part of a different context, different from, let us say, what you've been doing, like in the gallery circuit, for instance, or in an artist-initiated space, or in a museum in your country. So this offers you a chance to do different things. No? One of the strengths of the Biennale is that it is able to commission new work. No? So something that not an opportunity that is not always present in, let us say, the gallery system or in an artist-initiated space because of the condition of the resources. And so, of course, you garner cultural capital when you're part of it. But maybe the thing to say is that there are so many biennales in the world today. So, and the critique of the Biennale has also been so pervasive, no? That in fact it has become some kind of an industry.
Yes.
That is this critique of the Biennale, which is for another seminar, I suppose. So one has to ask, what kind of Biennale are you interested in? Yeah. Are you interested in the Venice Biennale or the Documenta? Or are you interested in other biennales like Manifesta or Jogjakarta? Yeah, so it depends, because these biennales operate within particular frameworks, and many of them resist the Leviathan or hegemonic, perceived to be hegemonic biennales like Venice and Documenta. No? But even Documenta, in 2022, it will be curated by Ruang Rupa, which was originally, still now, an artist-generated space. So one cannot throw or cast a blanket critique of the Biennale. And this is what I was trying to drive at in the earlier part of the lecture, that every curator brings a different intelligence into the Biennale
Mm.
platform. Of course, there is a political economy and a bureaucracy that kicks in at some point. But but one cannot be reduced to that. No?
Yes.
That the curator has an agency to do something within. And so I think the critique of the Biennale has to also consider that, and also has to consider the works within the Biennales. Many times, Biennales are reviewed almost like in very broad strokes, as if there were no artworks, as if there was no curatorial agency. No,
Mm.
it's like as if, it's just a function of a global machine. No? So I think that's quite unfair
Yeah, yeah. I
to,
think
to,
it's
to,
very
to the creative and critical labor of artists and curators in the Biennale. Yeah.
yes. Yeah, I think you pointed out that there are many different types of biennales.
Mm,
And yeah, it's so tempting, isn't it, to critique the biennale that way in broad strokes.
yeah.
But you mentioned that for the Viva XCon, that is an artist-initiated biennale.
Mhm.
Yeah, so how is that different from other biennales? And how would the relationship between the artist and the curator be different in that sense?
Yeah, that's a good question. This is an initiative from artists in the Visayas, because they thought at that time um, that they were not being represented in Manila. That when we talk about Philippine art, we talk about art from Manila. So they took it upon themselves to create the condition of a convergence. No? I mean, they didn't call it Biennale. They called it, it was a exhibition and conference that happened every 2 years. And then different islands can bid to host it. So it's like very organic and very artist dependent. Although they, of course, get support from the national government and so on and so forth, but it generally the vision is artist generated. Uh, but having said that, the idea of the curatorial at some point in the life of the Biennale became important. No? So for at the start, it was really just like a convergence. People can come, bring their own art, put up their own art. But they thought maybe this is also should also change. That maybe we can be more programmatic and less organic, I suppose. Uh, and that's how the curatorial would figure. But
Mm.
of course, the curatorial now would be in a relationship with the artist generated impulse. So
Mm.
how can, this is an important tension. No? Do we replace this impulse with a purely curatorial, framework
Mm.
coming from the West or somewhere else? But also, how do we harness the resources of the initiative so that it doesn't become some kind of a potluck all the time? Yeah, bring your own art. Uh,
Yeah.
so because that also has its excesses
Yes.
and has its limitations. So that is, I think, we are at that point,
Mm.
trying to negotiate these tensions between, a more organic, spontaneous, uh, freewheeling impulse and this, controlled, programmatic, discursive. Yeah, I'm sure these are false choices. I'm sure at some point in our reflection, they will have become false choices. But we're still going through that. Yeah,
Yes.
at
Yes.
this point. Yeah. Mhm.
Okay. I think there are some questions coming in.
Okay.
Let me read some of the questions to you. Yeah.
Mhm.
Neela is asking, how do you urge artistic expression, the need for art exhibitions at a time when it is considered non-essential in the public eye?
Yeah, yeah, I think that is that was also the issue in Singapore when I think they had I think there was a survey of non-essential professions, and I think artists were number two, the second to the most number of votes. No, yeah, I think the idea of the non-essential is important to reflect upon, and one way to trouble or complicate the idea of the non-essential is to locate art in the context of everyday life. Yeah? So if art is part of an everyday life, and if everyday life is shaped by emergency, as I have mentioned earlier, then it is essential. No? Because it is everyday life and it responds to emergency. No? So it also prompts us to rethink what we mean by art, no? What we mean by art and what we mean by the artistic gesture. So this is why when I curated the Singapore Biennale, uh, I looked at efforts or initiatives uh, that were not part of the typical art world in Singapore. Although of course they were not isolated from that art world. So I looked at theater, for instance. I was interested in performance. I was interested in the tour group that has, that guides you through the red light district and also through uh, the streets where migrants live. So, I was interested in that kind of practice, no? And I didn't want them to be just assimilated into the Biennale framework. I mean, just to represent them. I didn't want to represent that everyday life. I wanted it to play out in its own dynamic,
Right.
no? But also responding to the curatorial prompt. And I met up with them and they were so interested. They were so excited to be part of the Biennale, but at the same time, keeping their autonomy, of course, relative autonomy as practitioners. No? So as the integrity and autonomy uh, of their practices. So that was one way to expand the Biennale without being just expansionist. And that was also one way to broaden without being extractive. No? I didn't want that to happen because they were in Singapore before I came in and they will be there before I would leave. No? So I wanted to honor every step they did in the direction that they thought was right.
Thanks. I think that's such a great point because I think this is maybe perhaps an opportunity for us to really look at art and say, is it really non-essential? Perhaps it is even more essential than what we have conceived in the past. The next question is, what advice would you give fellow newcomer curators? And what important sort of lessons or adoption of best practices would you give to these first-time curators who will be conducting their first Biennale?
It's really different. But my only advice is to be true to the scale. And that's still, the title of this talk is to be true to the scale. So know your scale, know your context, and then listen to the voices around you within this context, and give the forms a chance to play out and to shape your curatorial vision. It's not some kind of template, no, in which you just
Yes.
put in, items or pieces. No? The context is generative. No? It should generate um, uh, forms. No, so I think that's the advice. And second is to have broad sympathies, as a person, not to be so consumed by art world speak
Mhm.
or e-flux or contemporary art, international contemporary. It's important, of course. It's your locus, but there is a wider world. No, this is the supplement that Spivak was getting at. No? Because there is so much lack, even within the aspiration to totality. No, so yeah, read. I mean, don't over professionalize. Maybe that's a good way to say. Don't over educate yourself. No, learn from other sources of knowledge. No, read natural history. No, read ethnography, read fiction, and so on and so forth. Not just art world speak, which is important because that is you pay your dues in that union, but it's bigger world.
Mm,
Mm,
mm.
mm,
Right. That's very good advice.
mm.
I also noticed that a lot of what you do is really also drawing from outside the field of art history. I mean,
Yeah,
anthropology, for instance. Um,
yeah, and also not to be afraid of doing something different, no? But not for the sake of being different, no? So the idea of the vernacular and also the local. The pandemic has carved that into very sharp relief. This idea of what it means to be local. So I
mm,
mean, so the locality and the scale, they have to come together. So, and that will give you your intelligence.
yes, yes. And I think that the next question is kind of related to what you were saying, from Eddie, who asks, how do you incorporate the local culture elements, whether within the Philippines, USA, or any other place, into envisioning or creating your own art masterpiece? I guess she's
Mm,
asking this from the point of view of an artist, and I think this is related to what you were saying about how the local and the contemporary are not really binaries
mm,
as we suppose. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So maybe one way to answer the one who asked is to first to get out of that straitjacket, no, of the local as the provincial or the peripheral, and the international or the global is out there. No? When we get out of that binary, I think a new world is revealed before us. So these are false choices, and the easier the sooner we transcend the binary, the better it is for us. And we won't ask that question anymore. So one way to respond to it is to ask ourselves, why are we asking this question? No?
Mm.
And it will lead us to that binarism that has to be surmounted. So if it's surmounted, we no longer have to ask it. We can ask better questions, more interesting questions, more productive questions.
Mm.
Mm,
Right, right. So
mm.
it's really about asking the right questions for yourself
Yeah.
first. Yeah, yeah. I have another question. um, how do you choose the artists
Mm.
uh, in the Biennale? How have you been tracking them, or have you been working closely with them?
Mm.
How do you?
It's really case to case.
Mhm,
Some artists you've worked with, and so you want to pursue their ideas.
mhm,
Some artists you do not know and would like to begin, experiment with him or her. So it depends. There is research involved in biennale process, and that's important to. And since this is a worldly biennale, the organizer assumes that you know the world, no? But that's an assumption. That's just an assumption. Knowing the world is also a function of resources. I mean, the Western curator might be more well-traveled, no? Can go to so many places. But someone like me, no, who doesn't have an institution who will give me the opportunity to travel, to just, look at art. So I am able to tap into a network in different ways, no? Through friends who are curators, in my travels as a curator and art historian, uh, books, of course, catalogs. So there's a mingling of sources, but there is research involved. And once you settle on particular artists, there is a process of working with that artist to propose a work and to like develop that work for exhibition. No? So that's one way to do it. Some curators are interested in. I can understand why curators work with the same artists uh, 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 time and again. It's because I think they know the artist well and that they will deliver. Yeah, because it's also you have to deliver, and if their work ethic or their seriousness, it's a greater risk if you don't know the artist, then the artist might not be able to deliver on time. Or it's a practical issue, but also quite important, no? And some curators work with artists they do not understand because it's a chance for them to broaden their view of what is contemporary art. Some curators work with non-artists like scholars, scientists. So there are many ways to choose artists, no? Or participants in the exhibition.
Right. And quite rightly, your role, your own seeing the universe, the audiences, the cosmos, and cognition together. Please tell us your story of development.
So that thing is the cosmos and cognition came from Kalibutan, which is the word that I made into a title for Viva 2020. No? So I'm struck by that word because there is no alienation between the ecology or the planet or the thing, which is the world, and the way that it is intuited or thought of or worked upon intellectually. So this cosmos and cognition uh, is one way. I mean, the ability of one word like kalibutan to bring the two together is an example of how vernacular knowledge can actually surmount Western metaphysics, which has informed our binarisms. So this could be an advice too for curators and artists, that to look at vernacular knowledge, not to idealize it or romanticize it or fetishize it, but to refunction it, redeploy it in a wider discourse. No? So this is, I think, this is one way to respond to that question of cosmos and cognition. This, the ability of the word to bring together inworlding and embodiment. Yeah. So when you have the word kalibutan, I mean, you are more confident not to lapse into the binary because the vernacular knowledge system already offers you this conceptualization. So there is no more need to be governed by dichotomies. No? So this is empowering or politicizing or also harnessing the uh, the uh, the energy of words, which are concepts, and as I mentioned earlier, which can become procedures, imaginations, yeah, philosophies. Mm.
Yeah, I get this sense all the time that in your work you're not afraid to sort of like let things cross over, or
Mm.
and also that you're in conversation all the time with the artists themselves, so that you let that conversation sort of help grow the direction or the project that you're working on.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right. Yeah. Mm.
um, so how involved are you as one who leads the creation in terms of talking to the artists?
Mm. Mm. Well, in this particular case, I worked with several curators. So each curator had a set of artists they worked with, and I had my own. So I involved, of course, from the very beginning of the task of selecting the artist, of talking to the artist. It's important to see them in their workplaces. No? So studio visits are important. So this, of course, will require travel. But I was able to do that. I was interested in one procedure in Singapore Biennale was to assign certain parts of the world to the curators in relation to their interest, theoretical interest. I wanted to broaden Southeast Asia, but through certain entry points like the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, and the South China Sea. So these were entry points into the larger world so that the expansion will not be random, but ecologically informed.
Right.
So I was interested in America, in America, in the Pacific, because of the Pacific, in relation to Southeast Asia. So I spent a great deal of, well, I spent my research time in the States. So I was interested in Carlos Villa, who was from San Francisco. I was interested in Alfonso Osorio, who was from the East Coast. And I was interested in Khalil Irving, who was from Missouri. I was interested in how race was shaped as a figuration in his art. So yeah, so some, of course, I mean, some spent time in other places. So yeah, so I was very involved in selecting the artists, in researching the artists, in developing logistics. Yeah, in developing logistics for things to be transported to Singapore. It was quite hands-on. I talked to a lot of the bureaucracy in Singapore is legendary. So it's a meeting culture. So you meet every time with different people, and it was instructive. Coming from a very improvisational culture, that was interesting. So I worked with educations. I worked with publicity and promotion. I worked with the publication, the design, the image of the main image of the Biennale. So it's a there are many unglamorous parts of the work. The glamour comes later.
Yeah.
If it comes, no, if it comes. But it's hard work. You write a lot. You write captions. You write text for the guidebook. You write text for the catalog. You write a lot of text with different registers because they speak to different audiences. No? And of course, I work with collaterals, yeah, with performances during the opening, things that will constantly activate the exhibition across its 4-month run. So you deal with collaterals too. So the curator, I can understand why the curator is admired and why the curator is also disliked. Yeah, because of there is authority invested in the curator, uh, but there is also so much work involved in, in the work of the curator. So it's quite a unique position. It's difficult to find an analog of the curator, contemporary art curator, in the other professions. Now, maybe someone told me, well, it's like a film festival organizer, but also different. Yeah. So it's different. The curator has so many expectations to fulfill. Expectations logistically, expectations from organizers, expectations to ensure that foot traffic is there because you have KPIs in Singapore. uh, and that, but you also are accountable to the intellectual community.
Yes.
The curatorial field, which is increasingly becoming more discursive, no? The art world, which demands something different. I mean, all of these things you have to juggle, no? And so it's quite, it's exciting but difficult, hard work, yeah.
Yes, yes. Thanks for bringing that up, because a lot of times we don't think about the unglamorous aspects of being a curator.
So many moving parts.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of related to also the next question that who wants to know, like, how do you balance that? Like, how do you not construct an artificial, carefully scripted presentation of themes? Like you were saying, how you also have a designated sort of like board of curators, or maybe even the government working very closely with them, and they have their own ideas about what the theme should be. And then how do you keep that balance?
Yeah, someone told me that the curator is a diplomat who has to, has to develop skills in diplomacy. The curator also should be. Kanagasabapati told me that when I was a bit troubled by questions, that he told me that, Patrick, you're a teacher, so just keep on explaining. I mean, by explaining things, then it will clarify at some point. Then it will also convince or persuade people who initially don't understand or refuse to understand. So there is the patience of the teacher, and then the skills of the diplomat. So, and you have to remember that I had a steering committee of around 15 people, and they of course had different ideas. Yeah, and I was answerable to that committee. I reported to the committee. So yeah, it's I mean, just I suppose to be very steadfast in what you believe is the right direction for that particular project. And I think to the question of how do you keep that balance or relationship between like organicity and some kind of framework. One way to do that was for me not to thematize the Biennale. I refuse to give a theme.
That's interesting.
Yeah. And that was quite difficult to understand for some people in the steering committee. Like, what do you mean there is no theme? It is for me, they are like crutches. No? The themes tend to dominate the discourse at the outset. So instead of a theme, I presented this line every step in the right direction, which is more an invitation or some kind of a call to arms or a prospect, no, but not a theme. So this uh, helped me avoid just uh, importing prefabricated issues like ecology, human rights, migration. I didn't like that procedure of just importing these issues and creating a theme to encompass them. I mean, the line of every step in the right direction would lead, of course, to these issues
Yes.
in one way or another. But I didn't put them up at the outset. Because if you thematize, then the Biennale becomes some kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes.
So curation is just illustrating, exemplifying the theme, not really performing it. No? So I wanted the Biennale to be performative in that sense, to allow the art to play out. Of course, this will not be easily recognizable.
Yes.
So
Yes.
that's also one of the that was one of the criticisms of the Biennale. That I mean, what's happening? So, but I think that's a good question.
Right. I,
Instead of, oh, this is what's happening. No?
yes.
When one is able to capture it, I think that's the end. Finale. So I wanted to move away from this aesthetics of capture. Of course, it won't give you spectacle. It won't give you signature forms. It wouldn't even maybe give you good pictures for art forum. But you know, we do biennales we like, and this turned out to be the biennale in my mind.
I'm so glad you pointed that out. I am really surprised that you got away with that.
with much patience, yeah.
And you got them to agree to it.
Yeah, at some point. Yeah, but I have to stay with the trouble.
Yes.
Yeah, stay with the trouble. So I did it, and I survived. Singapore, yeah, it's partly a hardship post.
Okay, the next question about curating. Can you talk about the selection process for curators? Do you know why you have been chosen for Singapore Biennale and for the Taiwan Pavilion? Have you been in the committee selection for a Biennale yourself?
Yeah, I have been in several, and every committee is different. So different procedures, different outlooks. No? So I was, for instance, in the last Sydney Biennale committee. So also very different. Like we were so many of them. We were so many there. So I wouldn't know how I was selected in Singapore. I was given they wrote me to say that if I could propose. So it was not an open call, I suppose. It was by invitation. So you're invited to propose. Yeah, and then you give if you're so inclined, you propose, and then the other invitees will also propose, and then they will select from the proposals. No? And then the short list will be interviewed. So I went to Singapore. I didn't know who the others were. They kept it quite, yeah, Singapore style. And then the Taiwan Pavilion, I was also surprised because I'm not Taiwanese, obviously. And the procedure there is different. They choose the artist first. They choose the artist first, and then they think of a curator. So instead of a curatorial proposition, they select the artist. And I haven't asked them why they chose me, but I guess it's has something to do with the southeast context of the artist, that it might be productive for a Southeast Asian to curate this artist that who is not reducible to the normative Taiwanese identity, something like that. I'm just guessing, but it might be that. And I was also told that they were quite keen to they were quite keen on my experience in doing in working in Taiwan, because I have had several projects in Taiwan. So they thought that since I was a frequent visitor and that I had contacts in in Taiwan, that it was not totally that I was not totally an alien in that scene. And also for me it's interesting because Taiwan is closer to the Philippines than Southeast Asia. Yeah, Philippines and like maybe a little under 2 hours. Yeah. So Philippines is closer to Hong Kong and Taiwan actually than to, let us say, Singapore or Thailand or Malaysia. Yeah. So it's an interesting. I'm looking forward to working with Sakulio. I don't know him. So
Right.
this is also another curatorial experiment. No, I don't know him. I don't have intellectual investment in his career or in his practice. So the first time I met him, the first time I visited was the first time I met the artist. I went to his hometown, tried to learn about how he works and his relationship with his family, with his community. So it was quite learning experience.
Okay. Also, I think I'm getting a message to try and wrap up.
Sure.
And I wonder if we do have a last question. Can I ask the last question and then we wrap up? Yeah. The last question is, do you work differently when you curate for a museum and for a biennale? Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, it should be different. Museums are governed by certain frameworks, no? And museums also have spaces, quite confined spaces. Uh, the museum is largely of course, a modernist technology. But of course, I'm oversimplifying because museums today are undergoing very radical changes. But typically, museums are confined to spaces and more or less work within like modernist norms. No, but the Biennale is different. The space is wider than just the white cube or larger than the white cube. It can also uh, work beyond modernism and its commitments. It can work with other people who are not part of the art world. Its discourse also is shaped by a specific discourse. It's a biennale discourse, uh, which is different from the museum discourse. Biennale discourse is related to contemporary art discourse and also to curatorial discourse. So the investments in curatorial discourse, in maybe biennale discourse, global discourse are greater than in the museum. And then the worldliness, I suppose, of the biennale invites a great deal of experiment, a great deal of risk-taking, that the museum as an institution, because there is this institutionality that governs the museum, that institutionality might not so be hospitable or generous to the the riskier gestures of the curatorial. No? So yeah, I think that's. But of course, as I said earlier, biennales work according to scale. And so it's also different. There are biennales that are based in museums. Like this one was, in a way, to some extent, based in the National Gallery Singapore. And we see that in Brisbane too, in Sao Paulo, in Istanbul to some extent. So they are based in museums now with existing frameworks. But they can also move beyond. But there are biennales that do not have permanent spaces, that they move around, like Manifesta moves around. So it's there is a great deal of indeterminacy, a greater deal of indeterminacy in the Biennale project.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Patrick. And we will have to wrap up. So that is our last question. So thank you so much, Patrick. I think you've given us so much food for thought, and also you've given us like a friendlier face to Curator. And
I hope so. Thank you, Emelia, for moderating.
Also, I think I have a new level of appreciation for curators, knowing that you have to juggle so much and you have to balance so many different considerations. And I want to just thank everybody for joining in, and I'm going to pass the time now to Datin Shalini Ganendra, who will have some closing remarks. Thank you, everybody, for joining today.
I just want to say a few words. The last 2 hours have been so informative and welcoming in terms of the message and the ideas really that stick or have come out so clearly is that the way Patrick practices curatorial endeavor is really about inclusivity and curiosity, and that makes his work so accessible. So for anyone who did have the privilege of visiting the Singapore Biennial last year, it was wonderful that there wasn't a concept that defined the exhibitions, that we could walk through and be curious, and it was a very tactile and earthy experience in some areas, and it wasn't over-intellectualized. Though clearly, listening to Patrick, you are convinced he is highly intellectual, but the presentation is so accessible that everyone can embrace it. So I think that's very welcoming and promising for the art world, which is filled with tomes of exclusivity. It's nice to break down those barriers and bring people together. And Emelia, you did such a wonderful job moderating. Thank you very much. And clearly, you know, Emelia is also very curious about very different things. She's just completed a PhD looking at independence era in Malaysia. And she's written a very successful publication, Malaysian 14 Artists, which I recommend to everyone to read. And now she is also practicing a full-time arts career. So thank you very much. A big thank you to Stephanie Key of Penang Art District for this excellent webinar hosting, and to the GWKL team who has been just fabulous. And we look forward really to the Luminary programs for tomorrow, where we continue the curatorial conversation with Wanda Nanibush from the Art Gallery of Ontario, as well as Liza Ahmadi, who's the founder of Asian Contemporary Art Week New York, and our very own Malaysian star, Elias Yamani, in conversation with Iqbal Rahim. And then at 5 o'clock, we have the third Luminary Forum. It's a full day tomorrow, moderated by Ernesto Pujan, and then we have speakers, Chairman of Sotheby's Islamic Arts, tuning in from London, Edward Gibbs, We have representatives from Indonesia, Museum Macan, Arancito, and many others. So we look forward to welcoming you. And GWKL pivots into the virtual this year. So the programming of most recommended galleries and institutions are online. Please do see the social media, #GalleryWeekendKL, as well as the website. If you would like to see a really cool virtual gallery, visit the Maybank Foundation Virtual Gallery, which is featured on the website. And really, just to wrap it up, I think this endeavor and this afternoon has really been about pioneering culture, and it is very much every step in the right direction. So I thank you and the audience, and I welcome you, Patrick, to tune in for the future sessions. And by the way, everyone, Patrick was on BFM on Thursday, and that radio recording is also available through GWKL. Thank you so much. Thank you all.